Welcome back, Left Reckoning patrons, on this Sunday. With me, I'm Matt Leck. With me, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, despite, the horrifying and aggravating things that are going on in the world. It was nice to do a little bit of escapism, read your review of this book here. You've basically had a bun in the oven for a while now with this piece. I'll put it up behind me here in a flashy way.
Nice.
Is that backwards, or you can read it? When black and white tenant farmers joined together to take on the Plantation South. We're going back to the 1930s Arkansas. Talk to us about that context, David.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things here that I think we have to sort of pull, and they're hard to pull apart. One is, this is H.L. Mitchell's biography, and I have it right here. I can't suggest it enough, honestly. I had the reason it took me a long time was I was having such a good time reading it that I had to reread it because I realized the first time I didn't take enough notes because there's a lot in here.
Just flying through it.
Yeah. No, because I will just say it's about the book first before we get into like the history. It's such a fun book. It's his autobiography. He's a really fun writer. The stories and the things we'll get into in a minute are really interesting, right? These guys are tough. They're taking on the Plantation South, the KKK, and all these folks. But there's just like a lot of other stuff about, as I put in my piece, just like everyday life, right? This kind of grand story just gets interrupted with funny bits like him and his buddy when they were driving to DC to go and try to get the FDR administration to reconsider some of their agricultural policy that was hurting tenant farmers. They got lost in rural Virginia, and their car broke down, and they went to go and get help. And they realized the place that they had broken into to see if they could get some help was a Virginia prison. And they realized they had broken into a prison, and it was very important for them to also break back out. Right. So, there's those kind of things, right? That, doesn't change much of the politics of the history there, but it's just like, there's a lot of really fun stories and aspects to H.L. Mitchell, who I have a tremendous respect for as an organizer and a thinker and a writer. But then the other aspect, obviously, is the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which is a really fascinating union. One, because of the things that we sort of highlight in this piece to sort of draw eyes to it, is I believe it was the first interracial union in the country. I could be wrong about that, but from as far as I could find, one of the first, if not the first, and certainly one of the most influential, particularly in the South. But we also have to recognize, in addition to that, what's so fascinating about this union, one of the things that's really fascinating about the STFU, the STFU is probably one of the only unions in American labor history, or probably labor history in general, that encourage people to leave. Right? Typically, unions want to maintain members, want to keep them in that kind of line of work. The STFU is very much like a class-rooted organization, and also an organization that was aware of the time. And one of the things that's fascinating about this agricultural system that they were organizing around is that, it's in between two worlds, right? What we might call the New South, or even the new agricultural system, right? Tenant farming gets beaten as a mode of production because of the the horrors and the brutality aspects of it, but also because modern technology sort of changes the way that labor's set up. So this was a union that was fighting for people that are in a kind of transitionary position in history and capitalism. In the sense of like what the South was becoming, what was coming next. It's a really fascinating story because, the victories and the fights that they were getting engaged in. But I mean, these are people literally living through history, and you sort of see it, right? First phone calls and all these kind of new technologies that are coming in people's lives.
Right.
So it's, so anyways, like the labor and the left socialist aspect to it is extremely interesting, but also just as like a text of sort of seeing this transition from the 30s, to the 70s is where the book sort of ends. It's also really fascinating seeing this America that seems in a lot of ways very far from us, right? America in the 1920s and 1930s, to something that seems a little bit more contemporary, which is, where it sort of ends. It's just a very fascinating bit of life. And I will just say a little romantically, I mean, it's a life very well lived. You know what I mean? To sort of be in the middle of a lot of history and a lot of movements, and to be on the right side throughout all of that is pretty impressive. So highly suggest it.
I overlooked that it was an autobiography because Mitchell died, decades ago. Actually, does it go into any of the context there, or like why is this coming out now?
Oh no, the book has been out for a little bit. I don't know when the first printing was.
Gotcha.
This one is a recent one that his H.L. Mitchell's son wrote the preface to. I think the book came out in 1979.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, so this is a re-release. But I will also just say on the preface aspect too, you know who wrote the initial foreword for the original 1979 edition? Michael Harrington.
Right.
The founder of DSA, who has one of the best lines ever, if you don't mind me reading it really fast. He says, "Reading this book is like having a conversation with history. Not the history of presidents and princes, but the history of those who do the dying and the living. We are enormously in H.L. Mitchell's debt." And he also has a great phrase in his preface that is, again, very worthwhile reading, where he says that this book is effectively a testament to the grandeur of ordinary people, which is a line that I really like. And yeah, I mean, we can get into a little bit more in a couple minutes about some of this history, but one of the aspects here that I loved in Michael Harrington's preface, and obviously throughout the book, is that it sort of looks at the kind of promise of the South. If I can read, I mean, we can read this really fast. This is an account of an indigenous American Southern and rural radical. Thus, this account of an indigenous American Southern and rural radical is not the description of an individual's aberration. It illuminates one of the richest traditions of protest and struggle in the United States, one which thus far has been beaten back by a system of entrenched economic power, made all the more secure by manipulation of race prejudice. But it might be objected that this past is totally past. There is now, quote, New South, part of the affluent Sun Belt, growing at the expense of the industrial North and without any need for H.L. Mitchell's kind of leftism. In this view, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union is a faded episode like the Confederate States of America that leads me to my last point, the relevance of H.L. Mitchell's fascinating life to the future of the South and of the indeed United States. The Sun Belt, Snow Belt distinction has probably resulted in a more careless thinking than any other recent theory. The fact of the matter is that the South, and particularly the part of it in which H.L. Mitchell fought his battles, is much poorer than the North. That is not to say that New York and Detroit and Cleveland have not been hurt by runaway shops. They have been. It is to argue that the beneficiary of that unplanned process with this enormous human and social cost has been the people of the South, has not been the people of the South, but corporations which have found relatively docile, unorganized, and low-wage workers and mean and penny-pitch welfare systems. And then he goes, sorry, just really fast. That is why the terribly long and difficult battle to organize the workers in the J.P. Stevens plant has had such an enormous significance. That effort, carried on against the concerted power of one of the most anti-union companies in the United States, could succeed. It could open the way to the dream of H.L. Mitchell and those hard-headed, practical, and everyday utopians who followed him, of an integrated social class movement fighting for democratic and economic rights, transforming the very structure of the South and of the nation in the process. If that were to happen, and I do not merely speculate about this, but like H.L. try to hurry up history, then the third Southern movement of that kind would be the culmination of 100 years of battle. So like, there's an aspect of like Southern history that I think is, even if you're not from the South, right, there's an aspect of the Southern history that feels very much like it is the American history, right? The South, for its population, for its poverty, and then also for its brutality in the slave system, has played a very outsized role in American history, right? It is a region that you could, if you're just sort of looking at analytically, sort of ignore. But why does the South play such a massive role in our imagination of ourselves as a country, our imagination of ourselves as a people? I think something that's very worth investigating. And what H.L. Mitchell and these folks in the Southern Tenant Farmers Union accomplished really points at some of the radical and revolutionary power and potential of this region, and not just in a kind of like theoretical sense, but in an actual rooted and real sense of what can be achieved when you start building class solidarity and class politics in a part of the country that has not seen enough of that, frankly.
Yeah, and you mentioned Lynn Frazier, the North Dakota nonpartisan league, who was the 12th governor of North Dakota. Who, and it's funny, you look it up. He was a popular governor, and he was recalled in 1921 because there was a business reaction to it. But yeah, I mean, so exactly right in line with the left reckoning. Jacobin did a good job assigning this book to you, I think. Tell us more about Mitchell. You talk about him going to see Debs as a young lad. Like, where was his ideology at?
Yeah, I mean, so I will say this for the last time because I think it's just gonna be very clear. I find that story very interesting because it really speaks a lot to some of the contemporary arguments that we have today. H.L. Mitchell was born into poverty in Western Tennessee. Working class family that sort of moved around a lot to find opportunities. So in that experience, he worked as a bootlegger. He worked as a sharecropper, most importantly. He also worked on the railroads. Just another aspect of why this story is so fun. He basically stopped railroading because he found a beautiful woman that took him away from work for a little bit. But, he was a very kind of typical character in the sense of his life circumstances, right? Poor working class Southern family moving around between Arkansas and Tennessee, just trying to find a way to get forward in life. And in Tennessee, he is a young guy, I think doing some work for a barbershop or something like that, odd job as a kid, of course. And this kind of funny guy from Knoxville comes into town and starts talking about this radical man, Eugene Debs, and gives a speech about Eugene Debs and the promise of this character. And it really sticks with H.L. Mitchell. So he follows around this guy for the rest of the day and just, peppering him with questions about socialism, about Eugene Debs. And this person says, hey, you should check out these blue books, which is a very fascinating thing that I didn't know about before. But they were a part of, I believe, a printing house in Kansas that wanted the history and the literature of the world to be accessible to working people. And basically sent them a small fee, and they would just send you books. So they would send you Shakespeare, most importantly for H.L. Mitchell, Marx, and all of the great Plato, etc. And H.L. Mitchell, this guy in the small town in Western Tennessee, eats all this up. And this is the beginning of his education. And I think that this is something that speaks to me a lot in my kind of personal life, and also with a lot of debates that you see on the left today, is that it is this synthesis between two things, right? Like the actual rootedness in like your lived experience, to use that phrase, or, your class experience, but also having that opportunity to like educate yourself. And in this case, this is self-education, right? But it played no small part in who H.L. Mitchell ended up becoming, and his worldview. And I think that it's a very critical lesson, I think, for us, is to one, recognize how radical and important that is in people's life. And two, that this belongs to everybody, right? That the guy in kind of rural Western Tennessee can read Shakespeare and Marx. Yes, we can encourage people to read and educate themselves. And it was a very formative aspect of him. Just briefly in the early biography, he basically moves around for a little bit. He gets a kind of small laundromat in eastern Arkansas, but as people know, he worked as a sharecropper for a while. But he worked in one of those kind of towns where it's just like the industry in town was tenant farming, sharecropping. And he was able to get lucky enough to sort of be 1 foot in, 1 foot out in the way that he was. But he ends up through, and won't bore everybody with this story. Effectively, he ends up in eastern Arkansas, where the soil was really rich, where there was a lot of activity, and becomes a member of the Socialist Party. And as a member of the Socialist Party, he becomes eventually the secretary of the Arkansas Socialist Party, and he meets Norman Thomas, who is Debs's kind of successor in the in the Socialist Party. And he's organizing all these chapters, recruiting more socialists in Arkansas. And Norman Thomas comes and visits him and a couple of his comrades one day. And Norman Thomas says, it's really great, all the stuff and all the work and money and the things you've been doing to sort of raise the cause of socialism and raise the cause of the Socialist Party of America. But what's really desperately needed right now is probably an organization for the largest group of laborers in your community, which is the tenant farmers. So H.L. Mitchell gets together with some of the other Socialist Party members and starts organizing the tenant farmers. And I think that that's something that I wish I was a little bit more explicit about in the Jacobin piece, actually, looking back at it, was that, this was an organization that was 100% like organic in the sense that like it spread like wildfire across the tenant farmers, but actually came from a kind of calculated position of the socialists saying, hey, we need to organize this large class of workers in Arkansas.
I mean, that's exactly how the North Dakota Nonpartisan League happened too. Those were socialists that were like, shit, we're not really getting a whole lot because the people we're talking to, they're like, well, I got this land and it's really all I got. Like, what else can you do for me? Before you just attack all this property, and but I mean, that should be inspirational in a sense that, like, I mean, this is working with the conditions you inherit, right? Like, this is kind of what Marx is talking about, and applying what you can to help the actual people that are surrounding you.
100%. And like, maybe if you don't mind, I might just sort of explain what the tenant farming system was like at that time, because it's a really bizarre system in the South. Most people associate it with a bad system. But, it was a system that rhymes very much with slavery. People didn't have the legal status necessarily of being owned, but as I'll get into in a second, you try to leave, they would get you. And how would they get you? Debt. So like life for sharecroppers was really rough in the South. Long days. Most people would work in the fields. And they were managed by a riding boss. Again, very similar to the old plantation system. One of the differences might be that like you had blacks and whites working together under the system versus like the plantation slavery system. And it was brutal dealing with these riding bosses who oftentimes were also the law. Oftentimes the sheriff would also work as the riding boss on the tenant farms. These people would work and growing mainly cash crops like cotton. And how did you sort of get enraptured in this system? Well, at the beginning of the year, you have to, planting season goes on over an entire cycle. So what do you need, right? You need tools, you need seeds, you need all these kind of things, and most importantly, food for you and your family. If you're renting, you'd also have to be paying rent. And basically, people would go into debt into the landholder, and they would oftentimes buy most of their food and fatback and grits and things like that from the company store, which was just charging usury rates for folks. And people were oftentimes paying interest as high as like 40% on those kind of staple goods. They sort of followed the planting system of, planting in the early spring. The summer, the work would sort of slow down, and that's where most people sort of lived off the land, hunting and fishing. But it's also when the plantation bosses would oftentimes pay preachers to come and do the big revival. I don't know how familiar you are with this map. It's a big Southern tradition, the big revival, right? So where you would come and have like preachers come, and it's very fire and brimstone. It's a carnival atmosphere, but it's like, God is punishing you for your sins. And oftentimes the plantation bosses would slip the preachers a little something extra to make it to be extra harsh on these folks to talk about their sins. And something that H.L. Mitchell notes is that, anything to make sure that these people were blaming their own sinful ways instead of maybe the economic situation that they were put under. This is a very interesting aspect of a lot of kind of Southern fire and brimstone religion, actually lining up with capital in a direct way of getting payments. And then work would, really increase obviously at harvest time. And people would, at the end of the season, would go and settle up with the bosses. And more often than not, they were in debt to the boss. And that would just sort of roll over into the next year. Also, most of these people were illiterate, didn't keep personal records. So the ability of the shop, right, basically saying, oh, yeah, you got this much, you got that much.
Right.
Was immense. And, there's plenty of stories H.L. Mitchell goes into where, somebody would sort of produce the cotton that they had. It's like, oh, you're $3 in debt still. And then they say, oh, actually, I have this much more. I have, another bale or so much. And they'd be like, oh, well, oh yeah, you're $3 in debt still. Right. It was funny math. And, if you wanted to get out of this system, because most of these people were in debt, the sheriff would come and chase you. They would come and they would find you in whatever town. So again, just talking about the relationship to slavery of sort of being bound to your boss and your employer is very, very direct under the system. And this was effectively, the system, particularly in the Western South, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, and Tennessee at that time, where the Southern Tenant Farmers Union really starts to germinate and grow is because of what happened during the Great Depression, where under the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the FDR administration, to raise the price of cash crops and agriculture in the country, called on the farmers and the agricultural producers in the country to leave a lot of their fields unyielded. And the idea was you do this, it might sort of reset the American agricultural system, raise prices a little bit so that these systems can work. And the federal government would pay you basically to not farm portions of your land. Problem is that might have worked well in the Midwest or in other parts of the country where it was small land-homing farmers. In the South, it was a disaster because who was getting those payments? Boss, the landowners. And who wasn't the significant population of sharecroppers. So all these people basically got no income, were getting laid off, being told to leave during this period of time. And you had unemployment and poverty running rampant throughout the South. Again, even though the FDR administration had also said that, hey, to the plantation owners, you got to pay these folks, right? That was in the initial text. The administration of that was done by the plantation owner. The money was sent to the plantation owner, and some fucking plantation boss in rural Eastern Arkansas is not too worried about the folks in Washington, D.C. coming and bothering them about this. So the Southern Tenant Farmers Union initially started organizing around taking advantage of some of the employment options that were coming from the federal government. And making sure that tenant farmers are sort of first up for employment opportunities that are coming from the federal government, but very quickly expanded into pay equity for the tenant farmers and sharecroppers, and organizing into this larger union.
Yeah, man, I was kind of just enjoying listening to you, but you mentioned loans and usury. Let's talk about, there's a flip side. We got to hear both sides to this. And on the other side of that is bankers. And, you talk about the role that the financial and banking sector plays, and just to, loop this back to North Dakota, that was a huge problem with getting the grain elevator built too, is none of the banks wanted to finance it. My recollection is ultimately they got a labor associated bank to put it up in North Dakota. But yeah, talk about the interest of banks here.
Well, yeah, and just two quick things. One is that when it came to debt, a lot of times people weren't getting paid in American currency, as you can expect. They were getting paid in notes to the company store. Which were not really convertible into American dollars and were not equivalent to American dollars. So that's just one thing to know, that like you couldn't even really save because you had a bunch of bullshit money that was only useful for buying shit at the company store. And yeah, no, I mean, the banking aspect is interesting. It's a little bit fast forward. So like just a quick kind of look here is that the Southern Tenant Farmers Union starts to grow. It starts to expand as an organization. You get more and more farmers working together and joining the union, and they start coordinating together to say, hey, we're going to ask for this much for cotton, and we're going to go on strike to ensure that we get this much for cotton. And they were really smart in the way that they did it. There's a fairly short window for when you can pick the cotton before it gets ruined, and they basically go on strike at that critical moment. And that obviously was met with severe repression from the Night Riders, which is a group we might get into a little bit more, which is an offshoot of the KKK, which is really trying to break the power of the union. Obviously the plantation bosses were coming at these folks, but they basically put together this very coordinated effort, particularly across Eastern Arkansas and a little bit in Tennessee, to go on strike and demand higher prices for each ton of cotton that was picked by folks. What's really fascinating about all of this is that certainly most of the plantation bosses and the KKK put the hammer down on all the people going on strike and fighting back. But even some of the plantation bosses or owners who might have been a little bit sympathetic and saying, hey, you know what? I'm making a good living off of this kind of thing. I got money. Let's pay these people what they're worth. I appreciate their labor, blah, 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 right? Achieving victory effectively. I might say, hey, we might recognize the union. We'll negotiate with them. We'll pay them the rates that they're expecting. They were put under pressure by, the police. First of all, let's just start there. The police were very threatening to these folks, saying, hey, you can't give these people anything, because if you give them anything, they're going to ask for everything. And the other aspect is very notable is the banks. The banking system in the South was very worried about the recognition of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union by the plantation owners, because that also might mean that more unions and more organized labor might be able to get a foothold in the South. So there's a very interesting story here in H.L. Mitchell's Tenant, where a lot of people were getting sort of pushed and thrown off of their homes. Tenant farmers are getting pushed and thrown off of their homes because they were in compliance with FDR's, ruling that they should be not producing as much cotton. And the plantation landowner, like just being out there with the people in the shanty towns that they were building on the highways in tears and trying to distribute food to them, because they were told by the banks, the local banks, that if they were to recognize the demands and make the payments out to the tenant farmers, that the bank would foreclose on the plantation, right? And this is something that happened over and over and over again. So it's a very interesting aspect to the story, right? Because there's, the story is at the intersection of a lot of things, like a racial kind of hierarchy in the South that existed at that time, a labor history. But it's also very interesting to sort of note the role that financial capital plays on even the boss and the employer relationship, where the financial interests were basically pressuring the bosses, not all of them. Let's also be very clear. This is like a small proportion, but it's an interesting aspect here that the banks was like, oh, this would be a disaster if because the idea is basically is if some guy in Poinsett County starts accepting the high union rates, then everyone else is going to have to.
Right.
And that's going to increase, that's going to hurt the profit margin for this entire industry, which was the financial bedrock, the economic bedrock of that region of the country.
No, that's important. And sorry to jump in, but I saw a Starbucks shareholder meeting a couple of years ago, where they were unable to understand why a company they invested in that they thought had good liberal values was treating its employees that were trying to unionize in such a way. And it's that's why, because there is Howard Schultz is doing his job based on the structure of capitalism. Yeah, exactly.
No, 100%. I think it's a really interesting aspect of this is that, yeah, the financial capital interest like plays a direct role in sort of determining the labor conditions for the vast majority of workers. And oftentimes they're just sort of left out as sort of, the pigs on the other end of the system is like the bosses do the dirty work and those guys just get fat off of it. No, there's a lot of pressure that's coming from that part of capital onto the bosses. And that's not to excuse the bosses who are playing a very purposeful role in what they're doing. But yes, it's recognizing culpability goes all the way down the spectrum.
Is there anything more you want to say about like the sort of culture of terror and racial issues going on at the time?
100%. I do highly suggest people read the piece, but I opened up the piece in Jacobin with this kind of snippet of a speech that was being given by Ward Rogers, who was one of the early organizers of the STFU, who said, "I can lead a mob to lynch any planter in Poinsett County, Arkansas," which is very incredible flipping of the image that we typically get of the South and lynching, right? Mm-hmm. And these guys were up against it from the get-go. The second that they started organizing black and whites together, the power structure, the police, and the KKK got heavily involved in trying to break this. And where to even start? There's it's an interesting story because at the beginning, H.L. Mitchell correctly recognized if you set up a white only Southern Tenant Farmers Union, you're just going to get it's going to be useless, right? Because whites are going to be used against blacks and blacks are going to be used against whites in the sense of like competing for labor. And it's a great way to break any kind of solidarity or economic power that the working class has. So from the very get-go, they were saying, we need to do an interracial union. It took some convincing. Let's be very clear about that. There were people out there who fought against it. In fact, there was a guy who was an early member of the STFU who tried to lead a split in the STFU to open up a whites-only union. He was a big admirer of this German fellow named Adolf Hitler, and proposed as his insignia for the new organization a green swastika, just like very much on the money for that kind of thing. But I
like Aryan symbology making it all the way to Arkansas. Like, what history are you tapping into, brother?
It's very fascinating, right? But he got soundly defeated. And, the insignia of the STFU was a black and a white hands clasped. And it was the proud symbol of that movement from the get-go. So of course, so they had to beat back some of those folks. But they also had to deal with the anxiety that a lot of black workers had for joining an organization like this. Arkansas, like many other parts of this country and also the South, has a history of pretty brutal racial oppression. And in the kind of background of this entire movement was the history of the Elaine Massacre, where a kind of similar demand from black sharecroppers just a little while before was met with with a brutal massacre. So, for black tenant farmers, there's this kind of question, hey, can we do this? Can we win this? Is there an actual commitment to actually building up an interracial union? Will you fight for me? Right? The Bernie slogan, like, will you stand up? Will you fight for somebody that you don't know? And early on in the union, they were getting some mobilization, but it wasn't obviously the full extent of the working class and the tenant farmers in the region. But a black organizer and preacher got arrested for holding a pro-union meeting by a bunch of the riding bosses in the KKK. They pulled him into prison. And the tenant farmers all got together and they basically showed up in a massive show of solidarity at this person's bail hearing. They snuck a bunch of weapons into the courtroom, actually underneath their coats. It's also notable that the ACLU refused at first well, not at first, in general, to represent them in this case. And they had to get an absolutely wild old South lawyer, this guy named C.T. Carpenter, who in the telling that H.L. Mitchell gives us is absolute character. Very much like, who you imagine, like an old timey Southern lawyer being, but a real like Jeffersonian, who was furious at the idea of like the liberties of people being denied. I don't want to speak to all of their perspectives on the world, but like was very animated basically on this free speech, aspect of it, and ends up representing this black sharecropper organizer.
Was he like this guy?
Yeah. Yes, sir. 100%. That great. Yes.
Number one, you're good at reading people. You have an extrasensory perception of seeing the truth. Number two, you have an analytical mind. You can.
I love that guy.
Yes, sir. No, like 100% that kind of character. Don't really know everything that's animating it, but like, yeah, exactly. An eccentric, fascinating old South lawyer who's mad that his Jeffersonian ideals are being challenged by the plantation bosses. And they basically organized a bunch of the white sharecroppers to come in and fill up the courtroom at this black members hearing. And as I noted, like they snuck in. They all were sort of hobbling and stuff because they were just like knives and weapons. And they didn't. But the point is like they were actually committed. Like if this person didn't get off, they were going to break them out.
Right.
Luckily, they didn't have to resort to that, and the judge sided with the STFU and released this person into the STFU's arms. But like that was a really critical moment in the history of the STFU because the interracial organizing plank went from just like a nice thing that they said that they wanted to do into an actual practical commitment. And if you read this book, Mean Things Happening in This Land, it's just filled with these stories of that kind of black and white commitment to each other, that solidarity. That was certainly unique in the South at that time, which is a really, really beautiful thing. But they faced terror. The Night Riders, which was an offshoot of the KKK, would come with machine guns and they would just obliterate people's houses. A lot of people died. Like, let's be very clear about this. A lot of people died in this fight. But they just never backed down. And that's the thing that's like so inspiring about reading this history for me, is that it's just like that kind of courage and that kind of like almost crazy belief. I mean, how impossible does it sound? Like if you were to be transported into that context to do what they did and to just have the courage and the confidence that they did, just really fast. Like H.L. Mitchell, an amazing little story about him. He was giving a speech in a town square in Arkansas. And one of the psycho guys who was a follower of J.O. Green, the guy with the swastika who tried to, make that into a white-only organization, one of his followers tried to assassinate H.L. Mitchell. And H.L. Mitchell thinks that it's a firecracker. Some guy starts shooting at him at the middle of this thing. H.L. Mitchell thinks it's a firecracker and just keeps on talking the whole time and like unfazed, right? But it's like those kind of things were just like gave people a lot of confidence and courage in taking on like a very, very rough thing. And let's be very clear too. These guys were armed, the STFU guys. They would fight back. They would intimidate and attack the KKK and the plantation bosses and all these people. So, it wasn't equivalent because the cops are on one side and the KKK is on one side. They were more well funded. They were more well armed. But these people took the fight directly to these folks, not in a kind of, foolish, antagonistic way, but they were prepared to fight for one another. And this like kind of early showings of racial solidarity between blacks and whites, like really, really made the membership explode. Because once black people in the South knew that this was a place that could fight for you and could win and would be committed to you, then, the barrier was very, very low for folks. And I think that again is like a very important lesson that I would take from it, is that like slogans and commitments are nice, but actually showing up in the way that they did really made a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like another example as to like when people say it's really depressing, how do you keep your head up? And the answer is, well, like, would you rather switch places with somebody in 1930s Arkansas, or are you willing to fight, where we're at now?
Yeah. And I mean, I'm just realizing there's just so much I feel like we almost just started, and I don't think we'll be able to get through everything right now, but like, what are some things that are worth for the Left Reckoning audience sort of looking at? They won higher rates for cotton picking in the region, which was massive. They expanded throughout the South, particularly in Texas and Oklahoma and Tennessee and Arkansas, and Louisiana. They did like wild ass shit. Like one of their big strikes, they got a guy who had a plane for some reason who just flew around all the different plantations and just dropped leaflets on. The plantation bosses didn't know how that happened. So they basically said like H.L. Mitchell, came and delivered these by hand. But of course, H.L. Mitchell can't be in every part of the South, right? There's a guy on a plane doing a lot of this kind of stuff. Really incredible stories. Was a really beautiful part of this story too when you read it, and we just don't have time to like introduce all the individual characters. But a lot of people like kind of down home, organic folks from Arkansas, from Tennessee, from Texas, who joined up and fought in this union. The socialist movement was very committed. The Socialist Party of the United States was very committed to this movement. So a lot of young folks came and joined the Southern Tenant Farmers Union as organizers, from a lot of them from the South, but also from all across the country. H.L. Mitchell was really, really good at PR. He notes in his piece, in his autobiography, and I noted this in my piece, that he's really good at separating well-intentioned Yankees from their money. So he's very good at being able to get money from, sympathetic folks in the North. They understood how to do PR, though. They put together pamphlets and reports on the conditions of workers in the South that became well-read across the country in the kind of labor and the socialist movement. They put together kind of documentaries and things like that to sort of go over the plight. And one of the big villains in this story is Henry Wallace, who people might know from the Oliver Stone documentary and has a lot of supporters. He's very much a villain in this story. The Department of Agriculture was very hostile to the STFU initially. They were very friendly to the capital of the plantation bosses. The agricultural capital there. Very famously, one of Henry Wallace's understudies said something along the lines to somebody who was sympathetic in some of those meetings to the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, who said, "Hey, why do we have all these interests of the cotton industry, of the indigo industry, all these other kind of big players showing up in Washington, D.C. and having their say and being heard by us? Why do we have no representation for the Southern Tenant Farmers Union or the tenant farmers in the South?" And one of Wallace's understudies said something along the lines of, well, would you propose a chicken sit on the poultry board, right? The metaphor is very clear there. And yeah. H.L. Mitchell played that to a T, and basically blackmailed the FDR administration, said, "Hey, I got newspaper writers all across the country who will be very happy to report this statement," and was able to use that to basically get the FDR administration to move. I will just say, as part of her lore, I would love to hear Harvey K's feeling about this, but we all know FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, early friend of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, and played an instrumental role in helping H.L. Mitchell and the Southern Tenant Farmers Union get audiences with FDR and his closest friends. So, they took on these folks. I think I do like to sort of remind folks about the fact that they had to take on the FDR administration, but I also don't want to deny the fact that, the FDR administration did move on this. But I think that the way to think about that or to consider it is less so, the FDR administration, like through their like wisdom and glory or whatever, did well by farmers. No, it was because these people organized and fought and made their voice heard that they got that.
And made their obligation one that they could not ignore. And, that is exactly what happened in Minnesota with the Farm Labor Party, is they basically did not numerous strikes, the Hormel chili, but also one against mortgages, saying, hey, we're just not going to accept this. And it's funny, the propaganda value of basically anti-democratic sentiment, saying, you are, the chicken on the poultry board. There's a famous one, Fargo Representative Treadwell Twitchell, which kind of tells you a little bit about, sorry to any Treadwells in the audience, but Treadwell Twitchell allegedly told farmers crowding the balcony that, quote, running the state was none of their business and they should go home and slop the hogs. And you see that phrase everywhere in the farmer propaganda afterwards, because of course that it tells you exactly what they think of you, and about like how dare you try to get involved with decisions that affect your lives and the lives of like your entire community.
Yeah. And I mean, that aspect is very interesting to see, that period of American history, how many comrades there were. I think it's very clear from H.L. Mitchell's perspective. There were social sympathizers in and around power within the FDR administration. It's very interesting to hear some of those kind of secret conversations happening, where when they first went to D.C., basically some commies helped them out. There's a lot of lawyers who were working for the FDR administration who had sympathies with the socialist movement, who helped them out a lot. A lot of them ended up getting purged, again, by Henry Wallace, just being very clear about that, for being socialists. I mean, so Jesus, I'm just trying to get a sense of things, because there's a couple more things I just definitely wanted to take a second on, just because I wasn't able to fit everything in this piece, obviously, because it was about a 1750 word piece. And there's some things that just getting into some of the history there would be a little bit difficult for just, even though it's a Jacobin audience, just a general audience. The relationship with FDR is really fascinating. H.L. Mitchell rubbed elbows with Spiro Agnew, a young Spiro Agnew, which is very funny, who is cheating on his wife in New Orleans. That's a story for another day. Just a little tidbit, again, to encourage people to read the book. Some of the things that I think are really interesting is the relationship of the STFU with the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. The Socialist Party is a kind of interesting one, because basically the STFU sort of lives through or operates through the end of the Socialist Party of America being a viable political organization in this country. And some of that was self-inflicted. Some of that was the weakness of the Socialist Party. As people might know, Megan Day has a really great, we interviewed her on this program. It's a great Jacobin piece, story on Commonwealth College, which was in Western Arkansas, that sort of, breaks down some of these interesting traditions of the American socialist and Marxist left at this time, right? The transition from the Socialist Party of Debs to the CPUSA. And the Socialist Party was, an interesting group, because you had basically a lot of idealists. They weren't very sympathetic to the STFU for a while, despite the fact that Norman Thomas and a lot of those people, Norman Thomas was just a absolute attack dog for the STFU, both within the party and also nationally. I mean, he would go and give speeches in Arkansas, and would be called, this white-haired Yankee by night riders and, people not sympathetic with the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, but very much a hero and a good comrade in this story. But the Socialist Party had this dream of the Midwestern small landholding farmer. And that became a big problem when the STFU became more and more radical, because one thing that's really interesting about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union is that, yes, they get higher wages and some better working conditions for the tenant farmers. But you know what they start demanding, Matt? They start saying there is a very Marxist, right? Capitalism has socialized production of agricultural products. We should socialize these industries and use them for the common benefit of all. So we should actually take agriculture and collectivize it. And the STFU actually takes on as a plank the collectivization of agriculture in the United States of America, right? Not private individual ownership of small land, the collectivization of agriculture. That creates a massive problem with the Socialist Party of America, which a lot of them were small landowners in the Northeast or in the Midwest. And they didn't like this idea of having their kind of personal property rights attacked. That creates a lot of consternation, certainly with the Socialist Party, and then obviously with the landowning classes in the South. They are not able to achieve this collectivization, obviously, though there were serious talks with the FDR administration to actually pursue kind of Tennessee Valley Authority style collectivization of agriculture. And we don't live in that world, obviously. We know what happened. But they did a lot to sort of set that up. They did set up a communally run farming operation in Alabama and Mississippi that was interracial, and in Alabama and Mississippi, which are places that had even harsher segregation laws than Arkansas. It's very interesting to see how they sort of dealt with the segregation laws. People were very mad because blacks and whites on these collective farming operations were calling each other brother and sister, or sir and ma'am, most importantly. They just replaced that with the good socialist word, comrade. Those farms operated for about 20 to 30 years. They ended up sort of running out eventually, and sort of almost more operating as institutions that were trapped in amber versus like kind of viable alternatives. But H.L. Mitchell, and I don't think that he's wrong in saying this, because this played a big role in a lot of the Southern imagination, particularly for the Black liberation struggle. These were some of the first black and white communities, integrated communities in the South ever. And I don't think we should take that away from them just because they weren't successful in changing that. And H.L. Mitchell, you can agree with him or not. I tend to agree that he says that he thinks that the promise and the story and the idea of these early collective farming projects in Mississippi and Alabama played a big role in inspiring the civil rights movement in the 60s, to sort of say, like, integration is a possibility here. And, for us, it's hard to imagine, what that was and how radical it was. But I do think that he's 100% right in sort of putting the STFU in that kind of historical tradition. Matt, you're muted. Sorry.
I was just saying that, that's fascinating and inspiring. And it's almost like you hear him talk about threatening guys if they come around with pillowcases on their heads. And it is sort of like a disposition you would hope to have if you were sent back there with a time machine.
But hindsight is 2020.
Exactly.
To do it then is like, yes, sir. Like that's very impressive.
Yeah.
And last thing I'll say is like, maybe I'll do something more in depth on this, because it does take a lot of history. Very weird relationship with the Communist Party. Unfortunately, the communists at this time in America, had a very weird relationship with Stalin. And it's not even just like, their acceptance of what Stalin was doing or anything like that. But a lot of these communist parties sort of took on weird positions to even the working class, right? That they were going to sort of take over these institutions. And the Communist Party basically tried to infiltrate the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. At first, they tried to recruit Mitchell. He refused to join. Then they actually broke into the Southern Tenant Farmers Union's headquarters and stole stationery and started sending out letters from the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, air quotes there, to try to maybe H.L. Mitchell will sort of line up with us. That obviously failed. Then they tried to, they made up a story about H.L. Mitchell misappropriating funds and sort of living high on the hog, to try to kick H.L. Mitchell out. H.L. Mitchell ends up being removed from the Southern Tenant Farmers Union on these kind of trumped up false charges. But after the extent of the Communist Party members deception was exposed to the other members of the STFU. He's reinstated. But yeah, the Communist Party basically tried to take over the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, and came really close to doing it, ended up failing. Which is, just a pretty sad chapter, frankly, for the STFU, and most importantly for the Communist Party, which is an organization that, we have ambivalence and kind of mixed feelings for, because it did a lot of really impressive things. But in this case, very much an organization that was less interested in working class liberation and more interested in sort of being in control of the institutions of the working class. And that was very much exposed in this chapter in particular. And there's a lot there. There's so much backstory. It's just I can't get into all of it, but it was an interesting aspect of this history. I don't want to ramble on too long, but we did the first quarter of the book. I hope that encourages people to read it and check it out. I will just say, a couple things that I'd like maybe to talk to you a little bit more holistically about the process, Matt, and the book. But one thing that's really interesting about this text is sort of seeing early on the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, the Socialist Party of the United Kingdom, the Labor Party was sending envoys into rural Arkansas. This is a wild thing to think about. And one thing that is really striking about this entire story is that the kind of community, the international community that was sort of playing a role in the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, there's just an interest in the extent of working class organization globally is fascinating. H.L. Mitchell and the Southern Tenant Farmers Union went to Mexico for a while, went and met with a lot of radical organizations down there. He went to Cuba and very famously refused to shake Batista's hand when Batista was still the dictator of the country. The Southern Tenant Farmers Union ends up joining the AFL-CIO. And it's a little bit up and down there because dealing with the kind of bureaucracy of that organization. The STFU, as I said earlier, is the only union that operated and actually encouraged people to leave. In fact, they sort of funded members to move to Detroit, to New Jersey, to California, and to other places to find work there, which is a very interesting dynamic within the union. And the union ended up becoming the National Farmers Labor Union after that, and then started organizing in California and Texas and across the country. H.L. Mitchell continued to fight for workers his entire life. He has pretty interesting stories about himself organizing fishermen in Louisiana late into the 50s and 60s, working with strawberry farmers in Louisiana, working with people in California. Basically never stops fighting for working people. He becomes a very important historian, as this book sort of implies, of this labor story, speaks across the country. And one thing that I just love so much about this book is how it ends, which is with H.L. Mitchell and some of the friends of the STFU, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, in the 70s, taking some of the money that he's gotten from speakers' engagements and paying out money to the surviving original members of the STFU, poor whites and blacks in the South, and sending them, what might be a modest sum, but was a lot to people back then, $50 or so, from what he was able to get from his speaking engagements, or for also putting a lot of the early documents of the STFU into microfiche. And it's, for me, it's just that's just such a great encapsulation of this saga and struggles that even up until the end, they were still sort of looking out for those original members.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important and inspiring. So I'm curious, are you going to be a book reviewer now?
I do have another one hopefully coming out for Jacobin. I mean, just started immediately after this. Book review is an interesting process, I will say.
I mean,
that's my
I
first-
book reviews, like, we're both Hitchens fans. I'm sure we've read him review a lot of things. It's an art form in its own sense, and the ability to. I mean, that I found so many books just through different reviewers. I mean, Oscar Wilde has a collection of reviews where it's not as good for finding, I guess, reading recommendations, but it's a very interesting art form. But my only concern is, and why I haven't done it, despite a couple offers since I've been doing this professionally, is I like condensing stuff like that. I always have a tough time. I mean, like, you've been talking about this, is like, there's so much to get into. How do you pick and choose? That's a political act in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's tough, and like, I think book reviewing is also such like a broad spectrum of things, right? Because there's like reviewing a book, like if you were to review like Sohrab Ahmari's book again on the program, right? I would review that very differently than this, right? Because in that you're sort of like, what are the main arguments of this book? Do they stand up? Are they strong? Blah, blah, blah. This one, I mean, for me, my intention, I went into it pretty open-minded to see, if I had issues with it or, whatever. But as I went through, it's like, man, I really think more than anything, I think people really need to read this, not just because it's a really enjoyable book, but because I'll just say this again, it's like one last pitch to read this book. I shouldn't say every, but the vast majority of the debates that we're having on the left, electoralism, should we be engaged in electoral? Intersectionalism, like how do we deal with the crisis of racism in America and the fight for economic justice? How do we deal with political education in groups, right? Should we expect working people to read all this kind of stuff, to be a part of an institute? Every single one of those things is in this book. And I find that to be really fascinating. And that was one thing that like really inspired me as I was going through, is like, I want people to read this book. So my intention with the book review more than anything was like, how can I, entice people enough to say, hey, this will be entertaining. It's gonna be fun, but also you're going to get a lot from it. Read this book, please. You're going to get a lot from it. But at the end of the day, I mean, fuck, my Jacobin piece, I think, was like 1750 words. My initial, the way I write is like, I write everything and I cut and I cut and I cut. And I cut. My initial book review is like 5,000. And then I had this moment of just being like, oh shit, I'm not going to be able to get almost like anything that I want to get in here. So how can I sort of highlight some of these things and highlight who these people were in a way that's enticing and interesting to people, and also give some folks some knowledge too, if they don't read it. And like for me, it's like, okay, what are the things that are really important from this book? H.L. Mitchell's analysis of the tenant farming system, I think, is one of the best I've ever seen. So that was a whole section in there. The racial organizing strategies, the interracial organizing strategies, I found to be a very important part of the tale. So I want to make sure that I included that. The things that were hardest for me to cut was the relationship between the Union and the Socialist Party of America. But just at the end of the day, that just had to be cut. So holistically, I don't know, what the answer is, but like, it feels like a pretty immense task to take something on like that. I feel very honored. I feel very close to all these people in a wild way. And one thing that really sort of broke my heart was after I finished writing the book review, Matt, is I found out that I believe it's either the University of Arkansas or the University of Tennessee has on recorded video interviews with a significant portion of the main characters from this from this autobiography. And just they're all older, obviously, when this was done in the 90s or something like that. But man, it's amazing to hear these people in their own voice and talking about what they're talking about, and just
we should try to get that.
Oh, we 100%. Well, there's two things I like. One, we should definitely do something with that. And two, at the end of the book, he talks about his union organizing in the South, and I'm forgetting it, and we'll just do something on this sometime soon. But he dealt with this insane anti-union movie that was being sort of shown across the country to captive audiences back then. And
Right.
I found the movie, and I think we should watch it and maybe get the Valley Labor
Oh,
Report
that's
guys or
great.
something and do like a watch of this anti-union movie from the 60s. And
That's
it's very
hilarious.
like Gone with the Wind, you know, like the openings, you know, it's like an idyllic town and like the camera panning in and like beautiful orchestral music playing in the background. But anyway, I mean, like, you know, anyways, book reviewing, it's fun, and particularly doing history stuff. I think, you know, I'll just say this is like maybe separate from the book reviewing is that like one thing I really wanted to drive home in my book review and in this and whenever I talk about this, I hope this isn't too cute or whatever, but it's like I have such respect for these people, and I put them up on a pedestal, right? I just like am amazed by the courage and the conviction and the strategizing that these folks were doing. But I think one thing that is really, really important about this story in particular is it's just like these were just normal fucking people. And that should give us a lot of confidence and hope for what we can achieve too. Do you know what I mean? It's like there's so much pessimism about everyday people, even on the left in this country. And what is so striking about this is like with all the social forces and all the history and all these things going against these folks, you just had normal fucking, you know, white and black folks in rural South just being superhumans. And I think that should give us a lot of confidence today. As you were saying earlier too, if these people can do it in the Jim Crow South, I think we should be a little bit more confident today.
Yeah. I mean, look, stuff is horrible. No denying that. It's been horrible. People inspiring throughout, doing inspiring things throughout it.
So I was wondering, unless you had anything else, maybe to close this out, we might have to cut this if we make this public later. But I wanted to include this because it's so beautiful, and H.L. Mitchell took a lot of power from this. The title of the book is called "Mean Things Happening in This Land." It's from Oklahoma University Press, which, by the way, I have not complained about once. But I did have a little issue with as a Texas fan.
If you look at the first letters of every sentence, it says "fuck the Sooners."
Damn, fuck, we just don't have time to. But very fascinating meetings that they had with some of the Indian nations too in the early days. But anyways, I'm gonna do more on this, so I'll bring up those stories later. But anyways. H.L. Mitchell took a lot of power and motivation from this person, John L. Hancock, who was a early member of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. In addition to being an incredible union organizer and member of the STFU, it was just really a troubadour for this movement. And one thing that I really love about this autobiography is it's just filled with poetry and snippets from songs and stuff. And one of the main people who he's relying on throughout this is a guy named John L. Hancock. People who might have had the luxury, which I didn't have, to grow up in a union household, you might know one of his most famous songs, which is "Roll the Union On." "Roll the Union On," which is written by him. But he also wrote this song called "Mean Things Happening in This Land," and figured we might play ourselves out with that if that works for you, Max. It's a really beautiful song that I think captures this moment in history.
There is mean things happening in this land. There is mean things happening in this land. But the union's going on, and the union's growing strong. There is mean things happening in this land. On the 18th day of May, the union called a strike. But the planters and the bosses throw the people out of their shack. There is mean things happening in this land. There is mean things happening in this land. But the union's going on, and the union's growing strong. There is mean things happening in this land. The planters told the people of the land where many years they had spent, and in the cold, hard winter, they had to live in tents. There is mean things happening in this land. There is mean things happening in this land. But the union's going on, and the union's growing strong. There is mean things happening in this land. The planters threw the people out without a bite to eat. They curse them and keep them, and some with axe shall beat. There is mean things happening in this land. There is mean things happening in this land. But their union's going on, and their union's growing strong. There is mean things happening in this land. Their people got tired of working, and that from sun to sun. But the planters forced them to work at the point of their gun. There is mean things happening in this land. There is mean things happening in this land. But their union's going on, and their union's growing strong. There is mean things happening in this land.